Evening. Did you know that learning a second language or many languages, it's a lifelong journey? I was talking to my students today about how I've been working on learning English as my second language, and it has been a lifelong journey. So as we go along, we have the sound that's perfect. I said that to them because today, as I was introducing my French immersion class, I was talking to them that yes, the day earlier, I was looking for vocabulary about extension chords. You're going to say, well, it's a silly idea. The only thing, though, is that if you want to become bilingual, or for some of you, you might know a third or a fourth language, in order to be bilingual or trilingual, or there's a word in English, in French, that's called polyglotte, which means that we know several languages, but not just knowing them, but being able to use them to communicate and be understood. That is quite amazing. The reason why I say that is too often people want to learn this a second, third, or fourth language. Then they realize it's a bit harder than they expected, but then they don't always have the chance to immerse themselves in that language and then be able to use it, and not just for a moment, but for a long time. Because the language, you can lose it if you don't use it as much, because sometimes your brain pathways, they focus on one part or the other. So welcome to my podcast today. My name is Alain Faber. I've been a teacher um, in high school for more than 25 years, and I've been working on French immersion program. And this is based on the idea that when I was in high school, and even before high school, one of the things I wanted to become was to become bilingual. So become a bilingual Canadian. So in Canada, we have two official languages, French and English. So I knew French when I was young, but then I realized that as a part of a country where both languages, French and English, are being used, not knowing the second official language was an issue if you wanted to better understand the other Canadians and be able to grow as a country. And that's one of the reasons, actually, I am working in a French immersion school and for French immersion program. For me, the idea here is when I was young, I loved to learn English so that I could become bilingual. And here I am in Ontario, where English is the mainstream language, and I'm participating in French immersion program to help students to also become bilingual Canadians with the two official languages here. Is it easy? Well, it's full of challenges, but it's full of rewards too. And earlier in the podcast, I mentioned the idea that if you want to learn a language, it's a lifelong journey. Because if you don't use it as much, what happens is you lose it. And I noticed that sometimes when I talk to students that have left the French immersion program for a few years and they have not used their French, they can still talk to me in French, but you can see that the confidence is not always there. So the idea here for tonight is that if you are in a journey to learn a second, third, or fourth language, make sure that you find ways and opportunities to use the language. It's not that your brain will lose the ability to do so, but you want to maintain the confidence to be able to use both languages the three languages. That's the goal for here. So in my podcast, I always break it down in three different parts. The first part is about learning. Second is about teaching. And the third part is about leading. My first part today is about learning. And I want to share with you that so French is my first language, and learning English was not necessarily easy. And I remember that I probably started in grade five, so probably when I was 11 or 12 years old. And the only thing I remember from that time was a sentence called a blue skirt. That's all I remember, that three words. And then I went to high school, learn English. And I remember that at some point I said, okay, I want to learn more. So I went to McGill University, where it was an English university, and I felt it was the best way for me to learn. First year was tricky. Second year was I went to the residence, And that's when I was able to make new friends and be able to speak English more and more. Now, when I graduated, I thought I had a good idea of English. However, having done a science degree, I had a lot of vocabulary to talk about physics and geology. But to be able to have conversation in different social settings, that was trickier. And that's when I said that when we are learning different languages, it's important to learn the vocabulary, be confident, but also have opportunities to be able to play with the language. And then after McGill, I got my first job in an English setting. And guess what? They sent me to college to be able to write in English better because I had to do report. Now, I work in a school where I work with the French immersion program. But on top of that, I started a couple of years ago to teach science in English as well. So what is interesting because at this point, it's coming to a point where I feel comfortable with both French and English, and I can teach comfortably with both languages, French and English, even though sometimes I'm looking for a few words here and there. But you know what? It's exciting because it's one of those parts where it's a journey. And I'm in a situation where I can both use my languages, so French and English, in every day. And it is exciting. Now, this is about learning. And keep in mind that as a learner, the best way, my suggestion to you is not to be a passive participant. If you're a passive learner, yes, you can gather the knowledge of the language, but you still need to find a way to apply what you know. And the best way to apply what you know is to have conversation with people, to listen to music and watch movies, and then discuss them with other friends. It's not necessarily easy, but it gives you a chance to discuss about different topics. Now, here in Toronto, there's several organizations where you can learn and speak French. L'Alliance Française is always something amazing, but there is also for French a place where you can watch plays. There's some film festivals. There's some committees where you can go with groups where you can go with French speakers and people learning French. It's quite amazing. And interestingly enough, sometimes I talk to people saying, well, English, sometimes it's easy for some, and it is. Because sometimes I consider English as if it was sometimes like a flu. Wherever you go, you're going to catch it. You're going to hear English everywhere. You're going to use it, and that gets easier. However, when you want to learn a second, a third, or fourth language, then you need to focus a little bit more. But it is feasible. I know too, I've worked with Spanish a little bit of German, but I don't use the language. Therefore, it's much harder for me to remember. My second segment of this podcast is about teaching. Now, when you are teaching students to learn a different language, the big difficulty is to be able to help your student overcome their shyness and build confidence so that they build the courage to use the language. And sometimes when I start, it can start with just the conversation. Hello, how are you? My name is, where you live. And people say, well, these are easy questions and easy discussion. I said, that's true. But if you think about people meeting in a restaurant, at the cafeteria, or at the mall, often these are the main thing they talk. However, having small talk help people to build the confidence. And therefore, when you add to what they know, then they get better and better. And that's what is important. I remember that the last time I taught grade 10 core French here, so for English speakers learning French, we have students where I had a list on the board of all the cues for conversations about all kind of things. And what happened is as the semester went, the cues were getting longer and longer. So instead of having a few questions and chatting, then there was more and more interaction possible. And something I was doing to help learners was at the beginning of a class, usually I would go with either a song, either a small article, sometimes a picture and discussions so that students could build some vocabulary so that I could raise their courage to say, okay, I have now read an article. I have heard the song with lyrics, and therefore I have more knowledge and more confidence to talk about that song, that article, or that topic from different sources. So these are tricks I have for people teaching for second language. Now, let's see the other one. The other thing that is interesting was the idea that if you know a second or third or fourth language, it's always a good idea to help students, help your trainees, help people around you to feel confident to tell others that they know two, three, or four languages. For example, I remember sometimes, well, it happened almost every year, every couple months. I meet my students either in for their first jobs in a coffee shop, in a grocery store, in a department store. So what happens is that I see them and I speak to them in French, and then often then you see supervisors not knowing that they could speak French. Because if someone can speak French, then you have the opportunity to have one person helping many different group in the community. And that's quite important. A couple weeks ago, I did some reference letters for students wanting to do volunteering at a hospital. And it's great to do volunteering. But if they are part of the French immersion program, or they are learning French as part of the core French program here, and they can have a good conversation in French, I do include in their reference letter that they can speak English and French. And if I know that they know other languages and they feel comfortable, especially if they talk the third or fourth languages at home, then it's an asset for those students. Too often we it's part of our private life, and we feel that we're a bit shy to share the information. However, it is part of value that you can give to your workplace, to your community. So these are things to keep in mind. With respect to leading or leadership, my point I have today, and I have a note here, is to know that if you think of languages, you have to guide your team members. If you're the head of a family or a group in your community, you need to help the people with you in your team to practice learning different languages and promote the idea that knowing several languages is important. And let's see, what was like I remember, so I'm not going to mention the city. So in Canada, we have a French a province where they speak French in Quebec, and other provinces where they speak English, where this French exists. And I don't know if you knew, but there's only one bilingual province in Canada, and it is New Brunswick. And the reason why I say that is that it was a situation where we had two cities in two different provinces where two different languages were spoken. So what happened is that on one side, we have a city that hired people that spoke both in French and English, but most of the time they spoke English because they were in the English province. And then the other city that they spoke French had French-speaking workers. And what happened is that they realized that it was hard for them to communicate. So what happened is that the French-speaking province hired English-speaking workers so that they could have better integration between the two cities. However, they realized that they had two groups of workers. They have French-speaking workers and English-speaking workers, and not necessarily bilingual workers. And the issue with that is that they end up in the same situation where you had difficulties interacting, difficulties to get projects to reach completion. So when we know that we have bilingual people in our team, it's important to nurture this idea. Because instead of having many people knowing their one language, or maybe two, if we have people that know many languages, what happens is that you have one person that can have in their mind, in their heart, being able to communicate to get the best outcome for the committee, for the community, or for the company. It's quite important. I talk sometimes with my students in French immersion, and especially people that are from like Asian descent. Like if someone can speak English, French, and Mandarin, for example, they can talk to 5 of the 8 billion people on the planet. Think about that. You have someone who can talk or can communicate with two-thirds or close to two-thirds of every single humans on the planet. This is a skill, and this is like priceless, and this is quite amazing. So here we have absence mental here. Are we too much? That's a good question. I don't know what you mean. I don't think we are too much. I think we are, as people that can know two languages, we have the opportunity to understand uh, both parties or both groups. And sometimes we can build bridges. Bridges are often difficult to build because sometimes it could be languages, it could be about philosophies, it could be about experiences. Being able to communicate that is always a challenge, but something beautiful to do. Ever so often, I do, like I was mentioning earlier this in this podcast, I was talking to my students about extension cord because I know the vocabulary in French and I was teaching science and I had to figure out some words that I did not know. So even at 50, I'm still learning new words so I can do my job better. So we can certainly learn new words and new ways to communicate, to have better relationships with people around us so we can achieve something better all the time. So hopefully that answers that question here. So thank you, and I'm very happy you are with us today. So the main topic of our podcast today is this idea that learning languages is difficult, but it can be amazing. But on top of that, it's not just learning the languages. We need to make sure that we can apply what we learn through conversing with others. With the internet right now, it's possible to talk to everybody, to talk to a lot of people around the world, and then build bridges so that we can be better in our community, better in business, and better with friendship. We always try to do that way. And this will be my podcast for today. If you know one language, it's amazing. I'm proud of you. Make sure that you learn and do the best you can in learning that language. If you're working on a second one, all the better. Gives you a chance to expand your mind, but also be able to talk to more people. And if it happens, you know, 3 or 4 languages, I have so much respect for you because I am working on 2. And it takes all my energy to make sure I can do the best I can. And if sometimes people say, well, I don't know how I can better improve my language skills, you can create a podcast or you could create videos on the topic you are working with. So this podcast I have right here is a way for me to practice and use my English language skills to communicate better. If you've noticed, since January, I'm doing a bit more videos on science because I teach science. And one of the reasons I do that is to allow me to create content where I use my knowledge of science, my knowledge of vocabulary in science so I can better teach. And in some way, it's helping me practice so I can do a better job. And you say, well, it is just a job. It's more than a job because for me, being bilingual is something that I find very important. And I'm always finding ways to get better. So on this, have a wonderful evening. I'm going to put a link here let's see. I don't know where I'm going to put the link. No worries. I'm going to wish you a good evening and come back here next Wednesday at 7:30. I always have a discussion about a topic that is about work, about teaching, about learning, about leadership, the 3 main topics I love to discuss. On this, have an excellent day, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.